relevant in these turbulent times. And a few housekeeping items before we start. Keep yourself on mute during the talk. Leave your video on or off, totally up to you. Put your questions into the chat as they come to you in the course of the talk, and that will ensure a lively dialogue as Allison finishes up. And be sure to attend the Victorian Society New York's upcoming events. March 12th is the history of looking for love through classified ads. March 17th is Janice Nomura, her acclaimed biography of the Blackwell sisters, who were the first and third academically trained women physicians in America. March 24th, we're co-sponsoring a talk with various partner organizations about the tragically heroic radical Rose Pastor Stokes. That's coming up on March 24th. March 30th is a talk on a new biography of the illustrator, publisher, visionary, tarot card designer, Pamela Coleman Smith. April 7th is our annual Margot Gale fundraiser, where we've got a preview of a documentary about the amazing dancer and impresario Loie Fuller, with some really amazing found footage. May 5th, great talk of David Freeland's groundbreaking new book on the history of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And May 10th, we'll be presenting our the winners of our annual Emerging Scholars event, and the deadline for applications is March 10th. CV, short description of what they're interested in, current grad students, current university students, undergrad or graduate, recent graduates, any aspect of 19th century culture, have them submit. They can see the links at vcsocny.org. And our speaker this evening, Allison Parker, is Chair and Richards Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. Her research and teaching interests include women's and gender studies, women's and gender history, African-American history, and legal history. In 2018, she was a Mellon Fellow at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the study of race and difference at Emory University, where she worked on this wonderful biography. As co-chair of the University of Delaware's Anti-Racism Initiative, she's helping build a coalition of students, faculty, and staff promoting a wide-ranging anti-racism agenda. And this book that she'll be speaking on tonight is fascinating and heart-wrenching and beautifully written. And I'm really, really, really proud to welcome her to the Victorian Society's Zoom stage. Thank you. Take it away, Allison.
Thank you so much, Eve. I really appreciate the invitation and the generous introduction, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. I will work on trying to share my screen here and see how that goes. Let's see. The slideshow is, sorry, I need to move that out of the way. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay, so can you see this image? Okay, good. I don't actually have as many slides as I usually do, and that's in part because I'm going to be talking about the part of Mary Church Terrell's family that deals with her history of enslavement, of her family's enslavement. And so I don't have pictures of those family members. Or not as many of them, of course, by the time you get back to the enslaved family members. So just to clarify, there'll be some times when the same image is up for a while, and that's why. So Mary, or Molly Church, as she was called, began her life in an era of cruelty and tumult and hope. She was born in the middle of the Civil War on September 23rd, 1863, in Memphis, Tennessee. And in spite of having spent her first 2 years enslaved, Molly Church grew up, let me see if I can get this going, in a privileged household. She learned how to use her class privilege and her education, her light skin color, and cross-class and cross-race connections in tactical ways to work on a range of social justice and civil rights issues. From young adulthood on, Terrell became an educator, a journalist, a public speaker, an organizer, and a civil rights activist. She brought her energy and leadership and determination through to the post-World War II civil rights movement. After winning a legal challenge in 1953 to segregation in just the District of Columbia in the U.S. Supreme Court, Terrell lived long enough to see the court issue its 1954 landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Unabashedly ambitious and passionate about social justice, Terrell claimed that she would have run for a seat in the U.S. Senate to pursue her civil rights agenda, if not for the barriers that blocked African-American women from attaining such positions of political power. In spite of such limitations, and by the time of her death, Terrell had become one of the most prominent Black women in the nation. So to start with, I'll provide you with a very brief overview of her life before I go back to the family history part. In the 1890s, Terrell was appointed as the first Black woman on the District of Columbia's Board of Education. In 1896, she was elected as the first president of the National Association of Colored Women. And in 1909, she helped found the NAACP. During World War I, she picketed the White House for women's suffrage with the National Women's Party and created the Wage Earners Association. In the 1920s, she was a founding member of the International Council of Women of the Darker Races. And in the 1930s, she continued her activism in the NAACP's Washington, D.C. branch and joined with the Communist Party's International Labor Defense on behalf of poor African Americans treated unfairly by the criminal justice system, including the Scottsboro Nine. In the 1940s, she helped A. Philip Randolph organize the March on Washington movement, initiated a lawsuit to integrate the American Association of University Women, and supported striking Black cafeteria workers who were resisting signing anti-communist pledges. Also in the 1940s and the early 1950s, Terrell spoke before congressional committees in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. She chaired two important committees affiliated with the Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization supported by the Communist Party. One committee demanded freedom for a Black sharecropper, Rosalie Ingram, and her sons, who had struck out had been wrongly convicted of murdering her white male assailant. And the other committee's direct action protests and legal challenges successfully dismantled segregation in the nation's capital. So over the course of her long life, Mary Church Terrell's wide-ranging activism and alliances were extraordinary, and yet she has never before been the subject of a full-length scholarly biography. So that was kind of an opportunity that was hard to pass by. Before I move on, I wanted to mention just a couple of things about the image that you see here. Mary Church Terrell is over here on the left with the big hat with the feather and the fruit. And then over here holding the baby is Charles Barnett, and the mother of the baby is Ida B. Wells Barnett down on the ground. And the person holding the baby is Alice Ruth Moore, who becomes Alice Dunbar Nelson. So there are many amazing women in this photo, but I just thought I would highlight a couple of the stars for you. And that's from that 1896 first meeting of the NAACW. But focusing on her history of enslavement and freedom from the Reconstruction era, during the Reconstruction era, and its connection to her activism, this talk shares some information about Molly Church Terrell's family history that I was able to uncover during my research. So Molly Church, let's see if I can, yeah, there she was. Oops. Go back. Yeah, here we go. Molly Church had a childhood defined by love and nurturing, but also by discrimination and violence. Racism and the precarity fostered by systemic marginalization shaped her understanding of herself and her world and made her determined to assert her own value as a human being through her activism. In this talk, I will suggest how her family history connects to her activism. I can share more about those many decades of activism in the question and answer period if you're interested. When he was an adult at the turn of the century, Molly Church Terrell's father, Robert Church, learned about his family history from one might think might be an unusual source, and that is the former white enslavers who wrote to him and offered him their own self-serving versions of the past. His White enslavers' family lore held that Robert's grandmother, Lucy, who was the seamstress and caregiver to her master's children, had regaled them with stories about being a Malay princess. And her enslavers found this plausible to them, since they claimed that she was, quote, a very bright red with very long, straight black hair, who to them did not look African. They described her as a beautiful French-speaking girl brought to the United States between 1805 and 1810 on a ship from the French colony of Saint-Domingue. One letter to Robert Church recounted how his grandmother had been sold to a rich Virginia tobacco merchant after a fierce bidding war. She had, he was told, attracted a great deal of attention by her beauty and the jewelry she wore, and consequently brought a fancy price. Slaveholding men's interest in an enslaved woman's beauty was not a compliment. Being a fancy girl typically meant that she was purchased to be sexually available to her white enslaver and for her reproductive capacity, against her free agency to choose. It condemned an enslaved woman or girl to the terror of regular sexual violence. And indeed, while enslaved on the tobacco merchant's plantation, Lucy gave birth to a half-white daughter, Emmeline. Lucy's second enslaver was a white Virginian named Dr. Patrick Burton. To him. Sorry, it's a bad image, but it's the only one I have. And he had actually participated in the first auction and had not managed to purchase her, but finally managed to acquire her around 1825. Another white Burton descendant explained to Robert Church that Lucy's first owner, quote, the tobacco merchant at Norfolk failed, unquote. Subsequently, as he put it, my grandfather bought your grandmother, Lucy, who at the time had a most beautiful young daughter named Emmeline. This Emmeline is your mother. He then casually revealed, my grandmother made my mother, who was then a baby, a present of this girl Emmeline for her maid. Emmeline was barely older than her young mistress. In their letters, written long after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Burton family insisted to Robert Church that his grandmother and mother were their beautiful prize slaves who, quote, never did any menial work, unquote. Although it is true that they did no agricultural labor, they worked from very young ages as seamstresses, personal maids, and caretakers of the Burton children. Most heinously, the Burtons sold Lucy away from her child, Emmeline, of mother and daughter as a simple economic calculus. In the changing scenes of commercial life, grandfather became a surety on a treasury bond and was forced to sell 100 Negroes at one time from Virginia to Mississippi to be sold to pay this debt. Among the number was your grandmother, Lucy. She was bought by a very rich planter near Natchez, Mississippi, who gave her the same liberty of action that our family had, and she became the seamstress of the family. Never in life was she treated as a slave. This event separated your mother and grandmother. Without empathy or irony, the letter writer could not see that this permanent forced separation was a searing illustration of the power of an institution that allowed a white family to have control over enslaved women like Emmeline and Lucy. Robert Church shared this 1901 letter with his daughter, Molly, who by this point in 1901 was a mother herself. She was haunted by this matter-of-fact recounting and recognized this uprooting as representative of the devastating familial destruction experienced by all enslaved people sold away from their families and friends. In her writings and speeches, Terrell used this example from her own family's history to condemn white Southerners for their hypocritical nostalgia for the days of slavery. She rejected their self-serving fictional descriptions of a world of whites and blacks living contentedly as one plantation family headed by an ostensibly benevolent white patriarch. Critiquing white Americans' nostalgia for slavery, which was really at a high point in the early 20th century, she exclaimed, When slavery is discussed and somebody rhapsodizes upon the goodness and kindness of masters and mistresses toward their slaves in extenuation of the cruel system, it is hard for me to conceal my disgust. There is no doubt that some slaveholders were kind to their slaves. Captain Church was one of them, and this daughter of a slave father is thus publicly willing to express her gratitude. But the anguish of one slave mother from whom her baby was snatched away outweighs all the kindness and goodness which were occasionally shown a fortunate favored slave. Highlighting the hypocrisy of whites who profess to love their mammies, Terrell recounted another piece of her family history to make her white audiences think. Both my grandfathers were white. Charlie McCormick, grandson of my grandmother's master, rushed to see and kiss my grandmother before he went and when he returned from school each day. He hugged her and kissed her, saying, "Oh, Mammy, Mammy, I'm so glad to see you." But in spite of their great shows of affection, Terrell observed, neither of her white grandfathers nor their families ever made any move to liberate their slaves. I would be a slave if emancipation had been delayed until the South voluntarily freed the slaves, she proclaimed. Enslaved people remained objects of affection from white slave-owning families and their descendants only if they remained subordinate. Although she conceded that enslaved Black women did their jobs as caretakers of other women's children well, Terrell insisted that her readers and listeners view enslaved Black women as three-dimensional human beings who were psychologically tormented by their enslavement. The anguish suffered by one Black mammy whose children were snatched from her embrace and sold away from her forever outweigh in the balance all the kindnesses bestowed upon all the slave women fortunate enough to receive it. She refused to romanticize, normalize, or excuse this cruel imbalance of power. Knowing that white Southerners were actively rewriting the history of slavery, Terrell observed, surely in their zeal to pay tribute to the faithful services rendered by the Black mammy, the descendants of slaveholding ancestors have forgotten the atrocities and cruelties incident to the institution of slavery itself. Calling attention to the other sins of white slaveholders, Terrell noted that the light skin color of many African Americans was not happenstance. Throughout her life, she insisted on using the word colored rather than Black or Negro to describe African Americans. In a debate over what to call the first national secular Black women's organization, Terrell favored the National Association of Colored Women. This was not an attempt to deny her own or Black women's African heritage. While studying for 2 years in Europe, she recalled, "Somebody would say, 'You are rather dark to be an American, aren't you?' Yes, I would explain, I am dark because some of my ancestors were Africans. I am proud of having the continent of Africa as part of my ancestral background. I am an African American." But she argued that the words Negro and Afro-American were more limited and implied the color Black. She insisted on emphasizing the point that people of her race in the United States had many different shades of skin color, ranging, quote, from deep Black to the fairest white, unquote. The word colored, Terrell insisted, allowed her to highlight the harsh reality of those with African heritage in America, the fact that Black women had been raped by white men. For Terrell, the word colored was an important reminder of Black women's lack of control over their own bodies and autonomy, and their insistence on gaining that control and autonomy back. Terrell frequently pointed out that her own enslaved grandmothers had both been raped and impregnated by white enslavers, thus accounting for her family's light skin color. The varied complexions of many Black Americans had a history, she insisted. The Black mammy had no home life. Legal marriage was impossible for her. If she went through a farce ceremony with a slave man, he could be sold away from her at any time, or she might be sold from him and be taken as a concubine by her master, his son, the overseer, or any other white man on the place who might desire her. Indeed, after her grandmother, Emmeline, was torn from her mother, Lucy, her new master allowed another white man to pursue his desire for her. Emmeline's story is as follows. So this Emmeline is the grandmother of Mary Church Terrell, the mother of Robert Church. Emmeline's enslaver, Dr. Burton, faced more financial problems since he had already sold 100 enslaved people, including Emmeline's mother, Lucy, in an earlier moment of financial trouble. This time, he moved his family and remaining enslaved people to a cheaper plantation in Holly Springs, Mississippi. There, the 24-year-old Emmeline gave birth to Robert Reed Church in 1839. Robert's biological father was a white slaveholding friend of Dr. Burton, Captain Church. He was of Holly Springs, Mississippi, and he owned a fleet of luxury steamboats that transported passengers, mail, and goods on the Mississippi River. Whenever any white man forced an enslaved woman to have sex, any resulting offspring belonged to her owner. Since these offspring increased the enslaver's wealth, owners sometimes forced women they enslaved to submit to sex with their friends, thereby normalizing sexual assault. White men cemented their ties by sharing enslaved women. And in a ritualization of rape culture, enslavers also brought their sons to their slave quarters when the boys came of age, inviting them to choose any enslaved woman to have sex with. This rite of sexual initiation highlighted their white supremacy, as well as a manhood that was imbued with misogynistic, racist violence. Dr. Burton gave Captain Church free and open access to Emmeline. After Robert Church's mother, Emmeline, died when she was only 30 years old in 1851, the Burton family sold 12-year-old Robert to his biological father, Captain Church. From then on, Robert no longer lived on a plantation. By that time, Captain Church resided in Memphis with his wife, Mary, and their 2 children. However, he chose not to bring Robert, who looked remarkably like him, into his home. Instead, he kept Robert out of his wife's sight by putting him to work in a series of unpaid menial jobs, including dishwasher and knife shiner on his steamboats on the Mississippi River. Thinking of her own white grandfathers, Terrell noted, "It frequently happened that on some plantation with the children of his white wife, little bronze images of the master might be seen, who sometimes resembled their white father more than his legitimate offspring did." Decades later, in 1891, Dr. Burton's daughter offered additional details to Robert Church about how and why he was sold. Captain Church, she claimed, had promised Emmeline that he would buy you and emancipate you and put you to school in Cincinnati. But Robert's father enslaver never followed through on his 1851 promise to the dying Emmeline, who had hoped against hope that her son would become a free and literate young man. In fact, Robert Church never learned how to write, and had a scribe always help him once he became an adult and prosperous. During the Civil War, the still enslaved Robert courted the beautiful and talented Louisa Ayers, who was 18 years old at the time. This is a little bit older. She was the enslaved daughter of a white Memphis attorney, T.S. Ayers. Robert and Louisa wed in 1862 in a ceremony attended by both of their white enslaver fathers as the official witnesses. Louisa Ayers had a half-sister who was also her young mistress. This was Laura Ayers Parker, and she wrote to Mary Church Terrell at the turn of the century, reflecting the nostalgic affection white families often had for those they enslaved. She did not recognize herself as a relative of Terrell's, but still insisted upon her closeness to Molly's mother and grandmother. Parker nostalgically claimed, "Your grandmother, Mammy Eliza, your mother's own mother, had been raised in our family and nursed my mother's 2 children, and we were all devotedly attached to her. She was present when my first child was born and would almost have given her life for my brother and myself and my own son." This was a classic claim of white enslavers to suggest that they knew and loved their blonde bond people well in a relationship of mutual devotion. But in her writings and speeches, Terrell rejected her grandmother's supposed willingness to almost die for her white charges. Whereas Parker's memories were all about the devotion of her former slaves, Molly's maternal grandmother, Eliza, provided her with a firsthand perspective on the miseries of enslavement. Grandmother told me tales of brutality perpetrated upon slaves who belonged to cruel masters, but they affected her and me so deeply she was rarely able to finish what she began. I tried to keep the tears back and the sobs suppressed so that grandmother would carry the story to the bitter end, but I seldom succeeded. Then she would stop abruptly and refuse to go on. It nearly killed me to think that my dear grandmother, whom I loved so devotedly, had once been a slave. "Never mind, honey," she used to comfort me. "Grandma ain't a slave no more." Like the enslaved women on Molly's father's side, Molly's maternal grandmother, Eliza, had also been unable to thwart a white man's lustful advances. Molly pointedly described her maternal grandmother as very dark brown, almost black, but noted that she gave birth to a fair-skinned daughter, Louisa, whose complexion revealed her father's race. In a gesture of affirmation, Louisa Ayers named her daughter Molly after her mother, Eliza, by giving her the middle name Mary, or what she was called Molly Eliza Church. Molly Terrell later reflected, "The fates were kind to me in one particular at least. I was born at a time when I did not have to go through life as a slave. I would have been a slave if slavery had not been abolished." In her mother's and grandmother's lives, Terrell saw dramatic examples of the power imbalances and cruelty of the system of enslavement and how women were at the mercy of their masters and other white men. In speeches to white audiences, she condemned white men for raping and assaulting vulnerable Black women under their control. She also vehemently condemned white women for not seeing themselves in solidarity with enslaved Black women and offering protection. The White National Purity Association first invited Terrell to give a talk on purity and the Negro in 1905. Her talk comprehensively laid out her Black feminist ideas about the intersections of gender, race, and purity, ideas that were shaped by her experience of raising 2 Black daughters in a racist society. Terrell used her time at the lectern to dispute whites' assumption that Black people were innately more immoral and impure. Shifting the blame to white men, Terrell defended the honor of Black women, reminding her audience that during slavery, it was impossible for bondwomen to protect themselves from the lust of their masters. Highlighting the vulnerability of Black women to rape by white men, she charged that even in the 20th century, colored women have been regarded as the rightful prey by every white man, and they have been protected from the wiles and lechery of their destroyers, neither by public sentiment nor by law. Louisa and Robert Church and their toddler daughter, Molly, were finally officially freed people when the Civil War ended in 1865. Soon after the war ended, T.S. Ayers helped his formerly enslaved daughter, Louisa, set up a hair store that sold hair extensions and wigs to upper-class white women. Upending traditional expectations, it was Louisa Ayers' church who was able to bring her family into real economic financial stability. Molly explained that her mother was considered an artist, and her reputation as a hairdresser spread far and wide. To her husband, mother was a helpmeet indeed, for it was she who bought the first home and the first carriage we ever had. Like his wife, Robert strove to be a successful entrepreneur, but he had a rockier start. He used his connections with prominent white men he had met on his father's luxury steamboats to obtain loans to open a saloon and billiard hall in Memphis. In mid-April 1865, immediately after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, Robert Church applied for a billiard license, but a county bureaucrat denied him explicitly on the grounds of his race. Church defiantly set up shop anyway, but by the summer of 1865, police arrested him for operating without a license. The police brought the charges under the local Memphis Black Codes, laws that had been instituted all throughout the South to curb the rights of African Americans right after the end of the Civil War. Church's court case went to trial just days after the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which explicitly overturned the Black Codes. Therefore, Molly's father won his case, Church versus the state of Tennessee, in a historic decision. As a business entrepreneur who had successfully defied the local regulations meant to constrain African Americans, Robert Church personified the threat to white supremacy that emancipation and Reconstruction represented. That made him a target for white violence. On May 1st, 1866, just days after the court decision in his favor, the Memphis Massacre began. As tensions over Reconstruction increased and conflicts between white police officers and African American veterans of the Union War turned violent. White working class resentments against those freed people in Memphis who had started businesses and were prospering also sparked violence. The mainly Irish police force led the Memphis riot. Whites killed 46 Black citizens, raped at least 5 women, and burned many African Americans' churches and schools to the ground. Louisa Ayers and their toddler daughter, Molly, huddled inside their home during the riot, but Robert Church ventured out to protect his new saloon. He was shot by rioting police officers, as Molly recounted. He was shot in the back of his head at his place of work and left for dead. He had been warned by friends that he was one of the colored men targeted to be shot. They and my mother begged him not to leave the home that day, but he went to work as usual in spite of the peril he knew he faced. He would undoubtedly have been shot to death if the rioters had not believed that they had finished him off when he fell to the ground. Although he had a bullet permanently lodged in his head, Molly's father survived. After the massacre, Robert Church took another great risk by joining Black Memphians in testifying before a congressional committee investigating the massacre. The riot had started on May 1st, and the testimony of 170 brave witnesses was published by Congress only weeks later. Thus, white Memphians knew the contents of the testimony. Church provided a vivid account of the rioting, and he was also asked directly about his race and status as a formerly enslaved person. "How much of a colored man are you?" he was asked. He replied, I do not know, very little. My father is a white man, and my mother was as white as I am. Captain Church is my father. My father owned my mother. Robert was unaware that, in fact, Dr. Burton was Emmeline's enslaver. Asked directly, were you a slave? Church replied, yes, sir, but my father always gave me everything I wanted, although he does not openly recognize me. No longer willing to go along with that charade, which identified Robert Church only as his former slave, Robert Church publicly identified Charles Church as his father in sworn testimony that was subsequently published and read all about town in Memphis. After the 1866 Memphis Massacre, Robert Church had to rebuild his severely injured body, business, and temperament. The Church couple began to have marital difficulties that eventually led to a divorce because Louisa could provide for the family, but she was unable to heal her husband, who was a changed man. The bullet lodged in his head made him desperately moody. Molly learned firsthand the long-term dangers of virulent racism, describing her father as having developed the most violent temper of any human being with whom I have come in contact. She recalled, sometimes the pain was so great that he threatened to take his life. Remarkably, despite his persistent lifelong pain, Robert Church survived and thrived, eventually amassing a fortune. He was called the first Black millionaire in the South. I don't know if he was actually a millionaire, but he was definitely wealthy. And he did so through very shrewd property purchases and by making important political connections in Memphis that cemented his status as a leader in the Black community and in Tennessee's Republican Party. Reconstruction, even after it was recast by the radical Republicans in 1867, carried dangers for Black Americans. Robert Church now knew this all too well, and after the Memphis Massacre, he decided to carry a gun at all times for self-protection. Molly remembered at least 2 incidents when her father brandished it in front of her. In one, a white conductor called her a hateful slur and tried to force young Molly into a segregated train car until her father showed him his gun. This show of determination, along with Robert's white complexion, enabled Molly to remain in her seat. She did not understand what she had done wrong, reporting to her mother that she was well-dressed and behaving appropriately. She never forgot this first of many times when she was treated harshly by train conductors. Thinking back to the tears in her mother's eyes as she tried to offer her comfort, Molly reflected, seeing their children touched and seared and wounded by race prejudice is one of the heaviest crosses which colored women have to bear. Her personal experiences with racism and discrimination inspired her later work as a civil rights activist and somebody who fought vehemently against segregation. Just before her 8th birthday, in the fall of 1871, Molly's parents sent her away to be educated in the North. Their daughter was an exceptionally smart child and a quick learner, and Memphis offered only a single inadequate school for Black children. To give her daughter the best education possible, Louisa chose the model school affiliated with Antioch College, developed by the educator Horace Mann in Yellow Springs, Ohio. For the rest of her youth, Molly never lived full-time with any member of her family again. Yet she was resilient and often a joyful child and generally rebounded from this basically permanent separation from her family. Louisa had made a good decision, her daughter concluded. Fate surely smiled upon me when she influenced my mother to send me to a school for children connected with Antioch College. When I contrast what my educational foundation would have been if I had remained in Memphis and been sent to the school for colored children, poorly equipped as those schools were then, with what was in this model school, I lift my heart up in gratitude to my dear mother for her foresight and for the sacrifice she made on my behalf. Although Molly enjoyed her schooling and had many friends among the white students, she was not immune to racist barbs. Once, her white classmates mockingly denied that she could be both Black and pretty. And Molly could not shake the memory of their taunting. I could hear the voice of ridicule crying out, "Your face is pretty Black." Such experiences led her to develop strong empathy for others treated badly on the basis of race. Whenever a Chinaman passed by and children, Black as well as white, sang out derisively, "Ching, ching, Chinaman, do you eat rats?" I invariably reminded the colored children that just as they made fun of Chinese people, many people made fun of us. Molly began to fight for her beliefs. She recognized that racial difference marked Chinese and African Americans as others in a predominantly white society. Choosing to confront white students about their prejudice led Molly into playground fights. I would run up to white children and declare with too much emphasis and bling that I liked the Chinaman's pretty yellow complexion better than I did their pale white one. Of course, there were always consequences of various kinds after such a speech, which were often decidedly unpleasant, but I made up my mind to stand them, whatever they were. Echoing her father's fearless determination to push back against discrimination, young Molly was unafraid of incurring the wrath of her white classmates, even if it meant getting punished by a teacher or getting into a physical fight she might lose. At the same time, she tried to convince her Black classmates that prejudice against others would only come back to hurt them. Being the target of racist taunts and remembering the terrors of slavery from her grandmother Eliza, Molly vowed to prove her own academic achievements that African Americans could overcome their history of enslavement and subjugation and be recognized as full citizens. She did so well academically that she was able to attend Oberlin College, where she insisted on taking the classical 4-year so-called gentleman's course at Oberlin rather than the 2-year ladies course taken by virtually all white and Black female students because she wanted to graduate with a bachelor's degree rather than an associate's of arts degree. Therefore, Molly was often the only young woman at Oberlin enrolled in fields of study that were considered the exclusive domain of men. Her friends pointed out that Latin and Greek were hard and that it was unnecessary, if not positively unwomanly, for girls to study these subjects, which Molly remembered they called an old dead language. And she said, "Worst of all, it might ruin my chances of getting a husband, since men were notoriously shy of women who knew too much." Molly did want to marry and had to ignore the common belief at the time that higher education damaged women and made them unmarriageable. As she pointed out, the world laughed at women students or scolded them according to its mood, then read the riot act to them and tried to deal a death blow to this new departure by warning young women that they would never be able to get a husband if they insisted upon taking a full college course. She worried that the naysayers could be right, but chose to take that risk and defy convention, happily noting, "Lo and behold, it was discovered that women who have studied the higher mathematics, philosophy, and Greek make affectionate wives, fond and devoted mothers, and safe, sane, and conservative cooks." Enjoying her gift for languages, Molly Church refused to restrict her studies on the basis of sex, just as she had resisted racist prescriptions throughout her life. In spite of studying diligently, Molly Church enjoyed herself and her friends. As she described it, "While I studied hard at Oberlin College and availed myself of all the opportunities afforded, I did not deprive myself of any pleasure I could rightfully enjoy." She especially loved doing silly pranks and dancing with her Black and white friends there. 75 years later, a dear white friend from Oberlin remembered that she first caught sight of Molly during a social hour after dinner, having been attracted by pleasant voices and laughter and fascinated by the central figure. She was evidently the admiration of her group of men and women students whom she was entertaining in the inimitable way that which she, throughout her life, had as a great gift. So she was talking about Molly Church. When Molly Church received her bachelor's degree in 1884 and then a master's degree soon after, she became one of only a few Black women in the United States to have earned both degrees. When she graduated, her father announced that he expected her to return to Memphis to live with him. She temporarily complied, but rejected her father's expectation that she would live a life of leisure until she married. I made up my mind definitely that it was wrong for me to remain idle. I could not be happy leading a purposeless existence. She wanted to put her college education to good use, as she put it, but Robert Church refused to let her engage actively in any kind of work outside the home. While a college student in the early 1880s, Molly had applied for summer jobs in New York City, where her mother then lived. But despite securing interviews, she had been turned down for every position. Whites admitted that she was qualified, but openly told her that they would not hire her because she was Black. This was, in her words, her first bitter experience of the inability to secure employment on account of my race. Her father's insistence that she not take paid employment stemmed in part from his concern that she would be taking the salary of a young woman who needed the income to survive. But he also wanted to show off his wealth and play the role of the generous patriarch, just as wealthy white men did for their daughters and wives. As Molly put it, naturally, my father was a product of his environment. In the South, for nearly 300 years, real ladies did not work, and my father was thoroughly imbued with that idea. He wanted his daughter to be a lady. But Molly maintained that she had been reared among Yankees and had imbibed the Yankee respect for work. She moved to New York, where she lived with her mother while applying for teaching positions. At 22, she accepted a job at Wilberforce University in Ohio, starting in the fall of 1885. Knowing that her father was unalterably opposed to my teaching anywhere, Molly Church took a calculated risk by taking the position at Wilberforce. She did not tell him about her new appointment until after she had moved there. He responded with one very angry letter and then refused to communicate with her for the entire academic year. For a few seconds after I read Father's letter, I was literally stunned with grief. He reprimanded me severely for disregarding his wishes and disobeying his commands. His reproaches stung me to the quick. But, Molly explained, my conscience was clear, and I knew I had done the right thing to use my training on behalf of my race. During the summer after her first year at Wilberforce, Molly decided to return to Memphis uninvited. Before she got on the train, she sent her father a telegram letting him know when she would arrive. She pointed to the irony that whereas some girls run away from home to marry the man of their choice and thus brook their father's disappointment, I left home and ran the risk of permanently alienating my father from myself in order to engage in the work which his money had prepared me to do. Fortunately, his fury had ended. There on the platform waiting to greet me was my dearly beloved father, who literally received me with open arms. So ended the most serious breach between my father and myself which had ever occurred. From her enslaved grandmothers on both sides, Molly learned about the terrors of enslavement, but also about her grandmother's capacity to love and to hope for better lives for themselves, their children, and grandchildren. From her white grandfathers, she learned the moral complexities of a thoroughly evil system. She knew that Captain Church had treated his son Robert kindly, but also that he had never educated or emancipated him. T.S. Ayers was similarly content to provide his enslaved daughter Louisa with an elegant wedding in his home, but also expected that she continue to live there as the enslaved nursemaid or mammy to his white daughter Laura, who had just had a baby. As a civil rights activist, Molly Church drew on her own family's history to critique whites' nostalgia for the system of enslavement, a nostalgia that never acknowledged the real harm done to enslaved family members who were separated, humiliated, and treated as less than fully human. I'll stop there and thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments you might have. I will also stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. That was really intense and raw and absolutely fascinating. And I've done some of my own research into a woman who moved to New York, an African-American who moved to New York in the 1890s in her 20s. And I guess my first question for you, Allison, is how do you not put your head down next to the laptop and cry sometimes when you read these testimony? It's often this awful black and white, dry documentation of something so emotional.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that it's important to recognize the pain and the trauma and the joy that people, including enslaved people, felt. So I hope that I managed to be not one-dimensional about this, because I don't want to say that it was that there was no way for them to create loving relationships, to love their own children, to find ways to have community. But absolutely, this work is really hard. And I've actually talked with people who work on things like slavery on a regular basis. I only did it for the first time in this book. This is not something I've ever researched before. And it was actually the hardest thing I've ever researched, not only because of the difficulty of the content, but also because it's so much harder to find people and learn about them when they weren't considered fully human and were sometimes not even listed in ways that gave them their names and the other kinds of things that you would usually use to follow a person through history. So I have a lot of respect for the people who actually studied the history of slavery full time.
Yeah. So but she had a happy marriage and 2 daughters. Can you just summarize really quickly she was able to form great emotional connections as an adult?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so interesting is that she was paired with a man who was kind of perfect for her, in that when she came to Washington, D.C. to teach in the prestigious M Street public so-called colored high school, she was in the Latin and Greek department that was headed by Robert H. Terrell. And he had been enslaved for his first 7 years of life. But then he went on to become a Harvard graduate. So he went from slavery to going to Harvard, and from Harvard, then he eventually got a law degree at Howard University and became the first municipal court judge in Washington, D.C., who was Black. So he was a pretty good match for her in that he was very brilliant and had achieved a lot on his own. And so he wasn't threatened by her, and he fully supported her career. So even as she ended up having a major speaking career, and that would take her away from their one biological child, and then they adopted her niece. So they ended up with 2 children. But her mother retired from her business in making the wigs and hair pieces, and moved in with them in the early 1900s so that Molly could continue her activism. It was in 1909 that she, had helped found the NAACP. She was super busy during that whole turn of the century time frame. And so her mother did actually come once Phyllis was born in 1898.
So did any of her family members that you know of vanish into the white world because they were so light-skinned? Did anyone else that you've been able to find, or no, they were staunchly, they were staunchly colored? It's kind of wild.
Yeah, no, they didn't want to pass. And so they were very strong Black Republicans. So they were part of what they called the Black and Tan. And you have to remember the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, right? So this is before the 1930s when the parties switched. And at that point, a lot of African Americans switched to becoming Democrats. But until the New Deal and Roosevelt, before that point, most Blacks would have been in the Republican Party, because the Democratic Party at the time literally called itself the Party of White Supremacy. So that was a little problematic. so not surprisingly, not very many people wanted to vote, for them. So that would be my answer to that question. Did I answer that fully?
So are there scholarships at Oberlin in her name? How is she memorialized? And right, does the NAACP have a lecture in her name, or what kinds of testimonials are there to her now?
It's interesting. Until the last 5 or 4 years, there was not much of anything at all. There's a Terrell school, or was one, in DC, but that was after her husband, not after her. And so it's a Terrell, but it's named really after Robert Terrell. And in terms of her, she was an interesting person because when we were able to get access and start sharing some of her information, let me back up. I met with the family in Highland Beach, Maryland, and they still had some papers. And we were interested in making sure that the papers got placed in an archive and got taken care of, because some of them were the love letters that she had written to her husband and from him in the 1880s, 90s, turn of the century. And eventually those papers all ended up at Oberlin. This is all recent, since 2015, 2016. And so in that context, first they put a plaque up to her in the Women and Gender Studies division. And then when Carmen Ambar, the first Black president, was inaugurated in 2018, we went back with the family, and there was another bigger celebration that involved a renaming of the library at Oberlin, which is now the Mary Church Terrell Library. The other thing that's happened very, very recently is that they're opening a suffrage centennial park at the Virginia Workhouse, where the suffragists were imprisoned after they picketed the White House. This is the National Women's Party. Terrell was there, and she and her daughter were among the few Black women who we have documented evidence participated in the picketing. She was not arrested just by chance, and so she didn't go to prison, but she's now a sculpture in the sculpture park that it also includes Alice Paul and other Lucy Burns and other of the suffragists. She also is now recently, this is all literally this year because of the centennial of the suffrage anniversary. She now also has a sculpture on a kind of Memphis Black history, Tennessee kind of suffrage trail. So she's got a sculpture there. But when I started this, I would say there was pretty much nothing over a decade ago. So it's all new and it's wonderful. And I hope that I can contribute to making her better known so that there are more of these kinds of things. So that's how I would answer that.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. Oh, we got a bunch more questions. So she and her mother lived in New York. The Victorian Society of New York asks, what was the New York connection?
Well, she only lived there in the summer, but her mom, after the divorce in the 1870s, moved to New York City and started a hair shop, which was very popular there, also for white women. And so that she lived there all the way through until the time when she went in 1898 to live with Terrell. But Terrell was in New York all the time. She took the train up on a regular basis. She went regularly to talk to publishers because she wanted to publish her autobiography for years, and unsuccessfully tried to shop it around. She went to talk to publishers of magazines to see if she could get pieces on lynching or the convict lease system published in the magazine. So, she was really hooked into the publishing there. She also went there regularly because John Milholland and the other folks who were involved in the Constitutional League, which was the kind of predecessor group to the NAACP, were based in New York. And so she would go there for the board meetings because she was on the board. She also was repeatedly invited to speak there. When she was trying to get to walk in the 1913 parade for suffrage in the nation's capital, she and all the other Black women refused to go to the back of the parade as Alice Paul had suggested. And they ended up marching all the way throughout the parade in all different kinds of formations. Some of them were there as homemakers or nurses or teachers, and they just went with their professions. The Delta Sigma Theta sorority went as a group in the college section for Howard University, but she and the women in the National Association of Colored Women were invited to join the New York City delegation of suffragists who were in the New York State. So they were kind of subsumed within the New York State delegation, but she marched with the New York City women. And the women who explicitly invited her were Mary Beard, who was the feminist historian, and she was good friends with Inez Milholland, the daughter of John Milholland. And of course, it was Inez Milholland who was riding on the white horse at the front of the parade. And she worked with Terrell on the day of the parade to make sure that the Delta Sigma Theta sorority members would get to march with the college section.
Oh, so she's the great martyr, right? Yeah.
So I have one more New York City connection is that once women got the right to vote in 1920, she was hired during every election in the 20s to go and stay at the Waldorf Astoria that had the headquarters for the RNC. So the Republican National Committee was headquartered at the Waldorf Astoria. And so she had an office there and did all of her work to round up what they called the colored, what was it? Basically like the colored vote, but that's what she did. And so she would go and give speeches to Black women, encouraging them to vote right after they had won the right nationally.
Absolutely wild, just tireless, right? And in this year of Zoom, to know about someone who literally attended multiple meetings every day, right? Okay. Oh, a couple more quick questions. How did you stumble upon this topic? How did Mary grab you?
I was writing a different book. My last book was called Articulating Rights, and it was on Black and white women's political thought in the 19th century. And I was basically focusing on a specific woman per chapter. And my last chapter, mostly chronologically, was with Mary Church Terrell. And as I was working on each chapter, I would read not only all their writings, since I was looking at their political thought, but I was also looking at all their biographies so that I could learn more about them. And so when I went to read her biographies, I was kind of shocked to find there were none. There is a lot of work that has been done on her, of course, but it's mostly in other books, right? Books about women, club women, books about Black women's activism. And then there were a few shorter books, but then also, strangely enough, there are over a dozen biographies for children. So there are a lot of children's books, and there's one young adult book, which isn't too bad, actually. But so there was a real dearth of information about her. And given how important she was, I was so shocked, and I was so intrigued by the ideas that I was finding that she had, that I decided that I would try for the very first time to write a biography, which is definitely an interesting thing because it's a different kind of writing. And I was trying to write for a broader audience, which, my other books were honestly were written for scholars and graduate students and not really meant to be sold widely in bookstores. But this one, I was hoping that I could actually reach out and have a book that many people would want to read. And so that was, for me, a kind of interesting challenge, which I hope I succeeded at. But that's what I was trying to do when I started to write this biography.
Does the autobiography manuscript survive? Is that one of the papers the family had?
Oh, yes. So the typed manuscripts they had, and so some of that now is at Oberlin. There are various drafts also at the Library of Congress and at Howard University. So our papers are in 3 places. A lot of the papers, except for some diaries and the love letters at Oberlin, most of it is actually duplicates from what's in the collections at the Library of Congress and at Howard. But it's really nice for the students because they not only preserved the papers, but made them accessible to anybody who wants to come in and do research on her. So it's a lovely setup that they have at Oberlin.
And someone asks about her entrance to the Antioch school. Were there other Black kids there, right? And was there an admissions test? How did she get access? Do we know?
I don't know about an admissions test. I do know that there were a few other Black children because she talks about talking with them about the Chinese, mocking the Chinese Americans who are walking by. So, but I think that she was one of maybe just a very small handful, because even in the town of Yellow Springs, there were only a couple of what you might call middle-class Black families. And she lodged with the Hunsters, who had like a candy store in their house. And it was a big, big house. And I think it was almost like a hotel. They had room for people to board. And so she lived with that family. And they were one of only 3 kind of prominent Black families in the entire town. So it was a pretty white community. I think if they had tried to inquire and ask her, she was just incredibly bright. She ended up being fluent in Spanish, French, Italian, German. She taught Greek and Latin. That was clear early on that she was really brilliant. And so I don't think that it would have been very hard for her to convince a bunch of people when she was 8 years old that she was worthy of going to a model school. So, and then they did have the money to pay for it. So that's the other side of it, is that her parents could pay for it.
Yeah. He's got a bullet in his head and he's a millionaire. It's just everything about that family, just their unfazability is just really striking. One other question, the National Woman's Party. What was her involvement with the National Woman's Party?
Yeah, so starting back with that parade in 1913, she knew from the beginning that Alice Paul was very hostile to Black women's rights and really had almost no interest in thinking about Black women as part of the struggle for the right to vote. But she also was absolutely determined to make herself part of whatever organization she wanted to be a part of. And she really liked Alice Paul's militant direct action techniques. So she liked the parade and she wanted to be part of it. She liked the picketing and she wanted to be part of it. And so she just went ahead and did it. And so when women got the right to vote and women's groups were joining the National Women's Party to kind of think about how to move forward into a post-voting world, Terrell was part of a delegation of women that went to the National Women's Party, and she considered herself to be a member, right? She paid dues and she picketed, but she also went with a whole delegation of Black women to see Alice Paul in 1921, right before a National Women's Party convention, where she wanted to be able to say that the group, the National Association of Colored Women, should be allowed to be a part as an affiliated member, because basically the National Women's Party was kind of taking all these other groups and making it a part of their group. Like you didn't join necessarily. It wasn't all individual memberships, it was also organizational memberships. But Alice Paul said, no, you're a race group, you're not a women's group. And so it was that whole thing of, white women considered themselves to be the only ones who had gender or femininity or women, and Black women were defined by their race. So that was incredibly frustrating to her. But then on top of that, she specifically asked if she could talk about and request that the National Women's Party take on the issue of Black disenfranchisement. This had been a major theme for her for decades already, because even though Black men had been given the right to vote in the South, quite quickly they had it taken away through a whole series of Jim Crow laws and tricks, right? To whether it's literacy tests that were super unfair, or poll taxes, or the violence, any number of things. So what she did is she said, we need you to look at the fact that now Black women have the right to vote in the South, but they're equally disenfranchised, just like Black men had been. And Alice Paul explicitly said she would not endorse the National Women's Party taking up that issue. So from everything that you would think, she would never talk to Alice Paul again. And of course, she was very upset. She knew full well that she was a racist, but she would not give up, because she shared some key beliefs with her. And another one that she shared with her is that she fully supported the Equal Rights Amendment. And so she would go with the National Women's Party and Alice Paul to the congressional committees in the 40s and 50s, testifying on behalf of the Equal Rights Amendment. And she managed to get the National Association of Colored Women to endorse the ERA a long time before that.
Right, until her last days, right? Yes. Unceasing, as your title says. I'm so grateful for this, Allison. So fascinating, so relevant, so important. And when you read someone describing, I can't protect my children from racism, and the Memphis Massacre, just the echoes to our time. Just absolutely fascinating. And one more thing that I love a lot of things about your book. One other thing I love about the book is how much we have in Mary's own words, right? Not a man telling her story for her, right? How much she was able to tell of her own story is really, really, really it's just really thrilling. And oh yes, sorry, I'm reading John Graham's in the chat. Oh yes, Hotbed. Yes, right. There was a show at New York Historical about Greenwich Village and women's suffrage and activism, which covered some of this territory. That was an amazing show. New York Historical has that great women's center, and they've done a ton of work documenting this period. Thank you. That's just absolute magic, Allison. Thank you so much. It's absolutely fabulous. And you have written a book for a wider audience. Could not recommend this more highly.
That's really good. Well, I'm really very grateful for the invitation, and I appreciate the fantastic questions, and I look forward to talking and seeing you again soon.
Well,
Bye-bye.
hope to see you in New York. Thank you so much.
Bye.